The silence stretched across the tarmac like a held breath, broken only by the distant whine of jet engines cooling in the desert heat. 458 soldiers stood at attention, their boots creating perfect geometric patterns on the concrete, sweat beading beneath their caps despite the early morning hour. They had been called to witness something unprecedented, a disciplinary hearing that would reshape everything they thought they knew about authority, respect, and what it meant to serve. At the center of it all stood Lieutenant Commander Vera Grim Kowalski, her flight suit pristine despite having landed just 20 minutes earlier from a 7-hour patrol over the contested waters of the South Pacific. Her hands remained steady at her sides, calloused fingers that had guided million-dollar aircraft through storms and enemy fire now motionless as marble. The only sign of tension was the almost imperceptible tightening around her steel-gray eyes, eyes that had seen too much, accomplished too much, and been dismissed too often. Across from her, Admiral Marcus Thornfield adjusted his dress uniform with the practiced arrogance of a man who had never questioned his place in the world's hierarchy. His chest bore the weight of 3 decades of ribbons and medals, each one a testament to battles fought from the comfort of command centers, decisions made from leather chairs in climate-controlled rooms thousands of miles from the chaos he orchestrated. He had summoned this assembly not for justice, but for spectacle, a public execution of reputation designed to remind everyone present exactly who held the power. But what the Admiral didn't know, what none of the assembled personnel could have anticipated, was that 18 hours earlier, Grimm had single-handedly prevented what intelligence analysts would later classify as the most devastating potential maritime disaster in modern military history. The classified nature of her mission meant she couldn't speak of it, couldn't defend herself with the truth that would have instantly transformed her from defendant to hero. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of jet fuel and something else, the metallic tang of approaching storm clouds gathering on the horizon. In the distance, an F-18 Super Hornet screamed across the sky, its pilot unknowingly saluting the woman who had taught half the squadron everything they knew about aerial combat. The irony was not lost on those who truly knew Grimm's record, but military protocol demanded silence, demanded they bear witness to what appeared to be the systematic destruction of one of their finest pilots. As Admiral Thornfield stepped forward, his shadow falling across Grimm like a threat, 458 pairs of eyes watched and waited, unaware they were about to witness the moment when decades of condescension, dismissal, and institutional arrogance would collide with the unbreakable will of a woman who had never learned how to surrender. The confrontation that followed would become legend, whispered in ready rooms and flight decks across every naval base from Norfolk to Pearl Harbor. It would redefine courage, challenge assumptions about strength, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a warrior's arsenal isn't found in any manual or training program. It's found in the quiet dignity of someone who refuses to be broken, no matter the cost. Lieutenant Commander Vera Grim Kowalski had earned her call sign during her 3rd deployment, when she had flown her crippled F-35 Lightning through a thunderstorm so violent that meteorologists later classified it as a Category 2 hurricane at altitude. With her navigation systems failing and hydraulics bleeding out at 30,000 feet, she had dead-reckoned her way home using nothing but instinct, and the positions of stars barely visible through the storm clouds. When she finally touched down on the carrier deck with less than 2 minutes of fuel remaining, her squadron commander had looked at the flight data and simply said, "Christ, Kowalski, you're grim as death itself." The name stuck, but those who flew with her knew it wasn't about death. It was about the inexorable certainty with which she approached every challenge, every mission, every impossible situation. Born in the steel-gray industrial sprawl of Pittsburgh, Vera had grown up in a household where weakness was not tolerated and excuses were met with silence. Her father, a Vietnam veteran turned steel worker, had taught her that respect was earned through action, not granted through birthright. Her mother, one of the first women to work the assembly line at the local defense contractor, had shown her that breaking barriers required not just courage, but the wisdom to pick your battles carefully. The path to naval aviation had been paved with skepticism and obstacles that her male counterparts never faced. During flight school, instructors had questioned whether women possessed the physical strength to handle high-G maneuvers, whether their emotional nature made them suitable for combat operations, whether they could earn the trust of their fellow pilots. Grimm had answered each doubt with performance that bordered on the supernatural, test scores that consistently placed her in the top percentile flight evaluations that used words like exceptional and unprecedented, and a combat record that spoke louder than any prejudice. Over 12 years of active duty, she had flown 847 combat missions across 3 theaters of operation. Her aircraft had been hit by enemy fire 17 times, and 17 times she had brought both herself and her plane home safely. She had saved the lives of countless ground troops through precision close air support, had intercepted enemy aircraft in international airspace without firing a shot, and had participated in rescue operations that pulled down pilots from hostile territory under cover of darkness. Yet despite this record, despite the quiet respect of her peers and the grudging admiration of most of her superiors, there remained those who saw her not as a decorated combat veteran, but as an anomaly to be controlled, a challenge to be subdued. Admiral Thornfield was chief among them, a relic of an earlier era who viewed the integration of women into combat roles as a social experiment that had gone too far. The morning sun climbed higher over the base, casting long shadows across the assembled formation. Grimm's squadron mates stood among the ranks, their faces carefully neutral but their loyalty unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read the subtle signals of military brotherhood. They had flown with her, trusted her with their lives, and knew that whatever had brought them all here today, the woman standing at attention in the center of it all was not the villain of this story. The investigation that had led to this moment had begun 3 weeks earlier with an anonymous complaint filed through official channels. The document, typed on standard military letterhead, had accused Lieutenant Commander Kowalski of insubordination, reckless endangerment of personnel, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The charges were vague enough to be troubling but specific enough to demand inquiry. A bureaucratic precision that suggested someone familiar with military legal procedures had crafted them carefully. What the complaint couldn't mention, due to classification levels that existed in black ink on documents locked in safes, was the nature of the mission that had prompted the accusations. Operation Nightfall had been conceived in the highest levels of military intelligence, a response to satellite imagery showing unusual naval activity in disputed waters near the Spratly Islands. Chinese destroyers had been conducting what appeared to be routine patrols, but their patterns suggested something far more complex than simple territorial assertion. Grimm had been selected for the reconnaissance mission not because she was expendable, but because she was irreplaceable. Her combination of technical skill, combat experience, and psychological profile made her uniquely qualified for the delicate task of gathering intelligence without triggering an international incident. The mission parameters were clear: fly low, stay invisible, document everything, and return home without being detected by either enemy radar or friendly forces who hadn't been briefed on the operation. What she had discovered in those contested waters would have changed the trajectory of American foreign policy in the Pacific, had the truth been allowed to surface. The Chinese naval activity wasn't routine patrol. It was the final stages of deploying a submarine-launched ballistic missile system that could threaten every major population center on the West Coast. The intelligence she gathered, recorded on high-resolution cameras and electronic surveillance equipment, represented the difference between strategic preparedness and catastrophic surprise. But bringing that intelligence home had required decisions that looked, from the outside, like reckless endangerment and insubordination. When Chinese fighters had scrambled to intercept what their radar operators assumed was an unidentified aircraft, Grimm had been forced to choose between following her original flight path, which would have led to certain detection and possible shoot-down, and improvising a route that took her through airspace officially designated as off-limits to American military aircraft. She chose survival, both her own and that of the crucial intelligence she carried. The improvised route had taken her through a civilian shipping lane during rush-hour traffic, flying at altitudes that violated several international aviation agreements, and scared the hell out of a container ship crew who reported seeing a gray ghost streak past their bridge at nearly supersonic speed. Admiral Thornfield stepped forward, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 3 decades in uniform. The assembled soldiers snapped to even greater attention, if such a thing were possible, their collective breath creating a moment of absolute silence that seemed to press down on the desert base like a physical weight. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter approached, its rotors beating a rhythm that matched the tension thrumming through every person present. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Admiral began, his voice carrying clearly across the formation without need for amplification. "We are gathered here this morning to address a matter that strikes at the very heart of military discipline and order." His eyes fixed on Grimm with the intensity of a predator studying prey. "The actions of Lieutenant Commander Kowalski have brought into question not only her fitness to serve in her current capacity, but her understanding of the chain of command that forms the backbone of our military effectiveness." The words hung in the desert air like an accusation, each syllable carefully chosen to establish guilt before evidence had been presented. Among the assembled personnel, faces remained professionally neutral, but those who knew Grimm's record felt the injustice of the moment like a physical blow. Lieutenant Junior Grade Marcus Dice Rodriguez, her wingman on countless missions, stood at attention in the third row, his jaw clenched so tightly that tendons stood out along his neck. Senior Chief Petty Officer Diana Walsh, the maintenance chief whose team had kept Grimm's aircraft in perfect condition through deployments that would have broken lesser machines, stared straight ahead with eyes that burned with carefully controlled anger. The Admiral continued his opening statement, outlining charges that sounded damning in their official language, but rang hollow to anyone who understood the reality of combat operations. Insubordination became tactical flexibility. Reckless endangerment became split-second decision-making under impossible pressure. Conduct unbecoming became the kind of moral courage that couldn't be taught in leadership seminars or found in regulation manuals. As Thornfield spoke, Grimm's mind drifted momentarily to the briefing room where this entire situation had begun. She remembered the weight of the intelligence folders, the gravity in the voice of the CIA liaison who had outlined the mission parameters, the understanding that failure would not be measured in career consequences, but in potential body counts measured in hundreds of thousands. She remembered accepting the mission not because it was safe or politically expedient, but because someone had to fly it, and she was the best person available for the job. The irony of standing here, being accused of failing the military she had served with such distinction, was not lost on her. But what struck her more profoundly was the realization that this moment, this public attempt at humiliation, was not really about her at all. It was about power, about control, about the fear that some men felt when faced with competence that didn't fit their preconceptions about who deserved to lead and who deserved to follow. Admiral Thornfield's voice rose slightly as he approached the climax of his opening remarks, and Grimm could see in his posture, in the way he positioned himself relative to the assembled formation, that he was preparing for something more dramatic than a standard disciplinary hearing. This was theater, carefully choreographed to send a message that extended far beyond one pilot's career. The morning heat was beginning to rise from the tarmac now, creating the first shimmering distortions of what would become a brutal desert day. But the weather was the least of anyone's concerns as the confrontation that had been building for weeks, months, perhaps years, finally approached its inevitable conclusion. In the distance, thunder rumbled, whether from approaching storms or from aircraft conducting training exercises. No one could tell. The tension reached a crescendo as Admiral Thornfield concluded his remarks and stepped directly in front of Grimm, close enough that she could smell his aftershave, close enough that his voice dropped to a register meant for intimidation rather than official communication. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested ownership rather than rank acknowledgement. "Your actions have not only endangered lives and compromised missions, but have demonstrated a fundamental lack of respect for the authority structure that makes military operations possible." The assembled personnel could sense that something unprecedented was about to occur, though none could have predicted the exact nature of what would unfold. In the front row, Colonel Sarah Banshee Chen, the base's deputy commander and one of the few senior officers present who outranked both participants in the drama, watched with the careful attention of someone who recognized that she might soon need to make decisions that would affect careers and reputations across the entire command structure. Grimm remained at attention, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the Admiral's left shoulder, her breathing steady and controlled despite the adrenaline that had begun coursing through her system. She had been in combat situations that demanded split-second decisions with life-or-death consequences, had flown through weather that would ground commercial aviation for weeks, had faced enemy fire with the kind of calm professionalism that separated elite pilots from merely competent ones. This confrontation, despite its personal nature, despite the potential for career destruction, was simply another form of combat, and combat was where Vera Grimm Kowalski had always performed best. The Admiral's next words were spoken quietly, meant to be heard only by Grimm herself, but in the absolute silence that had settled over the formation, they carried clearly to every person present. "The problem with women like you, Commander, is that you never learned your place. Today, that changes." As he spoke, his right hand moved, not in any gesture that could be described as official or appropriate, but in a motion that every person present recognized as the prelude to physical aggression. What happened next unfolded with the precision and inevitability of a perfectly executed tactical maneuver. Grimm's response was not the product of anger or emotion, but of training that had been drilled into her through years of military close combat instruction, and reinforced by practical experience in situations where hesitation meant death. As the Admiral's hand moved toward her, reaching for what could only be intended as an act of physical dominance disguised as official contact, her own movement began. The arm lock that followed was textbook perfect, executed with the kind of mechanical precision that spoke of countless hours of practice and the muscle memory that develops only through absolute dedication to craft. Admiral Thornfield found his aggressive motion redirected, his own momentum and body weight turned against him in a way that left him no option but to follow the path that Grimm's technique had created. The takedown that resulted was not violent or vindictive, but simply the natural conclusion of physics applied by someone who understood leverage, timing, and the human body's limitations. The Admiral hit the tarmac with a sound that carried clearly across the formation, not the devastating impact of someone being brutally attacked, but the controlled conclusion of a defensive technique performed by someone who could have inflicted serious damage but had chosen restraint instead. He lay there for a moment, stunned not by pain, but by the complete reversal of the power dynamic he had assumed was his to control. 458 soldiers witnessed the moment when decades of accumulated assumptions about strength, authority, and respect were redefined in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. They watched as Lieutenant Commander Vera Grimm Kowalski stepped back, resumed her position of attention, and waited for whatever would come next with the same unshakable composure she had shown throughout the entire confrontation. The silence that followed was different from what had come before, not the held breath of anticipation, but the absolute stillness that occurs when everyone present realizes they have just witnessed something that will be remembered and discussed for years to come. Colonel Chen stepped forward, her face carefully neutral but her eyes showing the sharp intelligence of someone rapidly calculating the political and legal implications of what had just occurred. In the ranks, Dice Rodriguez allowed himself the smallest of smiles, while Senior Chief Walsh felt a surge of pride that she would later describe as the most satisfying moment of her 23-year career. They had watched their friend, their colleague, their squadron mate defend herself with exactly the kind of measured professionalism they had come to expect from her in every other situation. The woman they had flown with, worked with, and respected had just proven that her composure under pressure extended far beyond the cockpit of a fighter aircraft. Admiral Thornfield struggled to his feet, his dress uniform now bearing the dust of the tarmac and his dignity considerably more damaged than his body. The look in his eyes had changed from arrogant confidence to something approaching shock, as if he were seeing Grim clearly for the first time. Around him, the assembled personnel maintained their professional bearing, but the shift in atmosphere was palpable. What had begun as a stage for demonstrating dominance had become something entirely different. Colonel Chen's voice cut through the silence with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions in crisis situations. "Admiral Thornfield," she said, her tone carrying the diplomatic precision of someone who understood that every word would be analyzed and recorded. "I believe we need to discuss the proper procedures for conducting disciplinary hearings." "Lieutenant Commander Kowalski," she continued, turning toward Grim, "you will remain available for further questions, but you are dismissed from this formation." As Grim executed a perfect about-face and began walking toward the hangar complex, her steps echoing clearly in the morning air, she could feel the weight of 458 pairs of eyes following her progress. But the sensation was not one of judgment or condemnation. It was the recognition that sometimes, when all other options have been exhausted, the only response to institutional bullying is the kind of quiet, professional resistance that speaks louder than any formal complaint or legal proceeding. The investigation that followed would consume weeks of official attention and generate thousands of pages of testimony, statements, and analysis. Military legal experts would debate the finer points of self-defense, command authority, and appropriate conduct in official proceedings. But for those who had been present on that desert morning, the essential truth of what had occurred was far simpler than any legal analysis could capture. They had watched a decorated combat veteran defend herself against behavior that had no place in a professional military environment. They had seen someone refuse to be intimidated or diminished, regardless of the rank or supposed authority of her antagonist. Most importantly, they had witnessed the kind of moral courage that could not be taught in leadership courses or found in regulation manuals. The courage to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. In the days that followed, as word of the incident spread through the informal networks that connected military personnel across the globe, Lieutenant Commander Vera Grim Kowalski became something she had never sought to be, a symbol. Stories of her combat record, previously known only to those who had served directly with her, began circulating in ready rooms and mess halls from Pensacola to San Diego. The same pilots who had respected her professionalism and skill now spoke of her with something approaching reverence. The official investigation proceeded with the methodical precision that characterizes military legal proceedings. Statements were taken from every witness, video recordings were analyzed frame by frame, and expert testimony was gathered on everything from combat stress reactions to appropriate force responses in defensive situations. But while the lawyers and investigators built their cases, a different kind of judgment was being rendered in the court of professional opinion. Lieutenant Junior Grade Rodriguez found himself fielding questions from pilots across the fleet who wanted to know what it was really like to fly with Grim, what kind of leader she was under pressure, whether the stories about her combat record were accurate or enhanced by the kind of myth-making that often surrounds military legends. His answers were consistently matter-of-fact. She was the best pilot he had ever flown with, the kind of leader who never asked others to take risks she wouldn't take herself, and someone whose judgment under fire had saved more lives than anyone would ever know. Senior Chief Walsh faced similar inquiries from maintenance personnel who wanted to understand how someone could maintain such perfect composure under circumstances that would have broken lesser individuals. Her response was equally straightforward. Grimm treated everyone with respect regardless of rank, never blamed maintenance issues on the crew, and had personally written commendation letters for techs who had gone above and beyond during critical missions. These testimonials, shared informally through the networks that connected military personnel across services and continents, began to paint a picture of Lieutenant Commander Kowalski that stood in stark contrast to the official charges she faced. Instead of an insubordinate officer who endangered lives through reckless behavior, the emerging portrait was of a consummate professional who had consistently demonstrated the highest standards of military excellence. The turning point in public perception came when the details of Operation Nightfall were partially declassified through what intelligence analysts later described as strategic leaking, by officials who understood that justice sometimes required transparency, regardless of classification protocols. The information that emerged painted a picture of a mission so sensitive and critical that its success or failure could have altered the strategic balance of power in the Pacific theater. Reading between the lines of the heavily redacted reports that found their way to certain journalists and military analysts, it became clear that Lieutenant Commander Kowalski had not only completed a nearly impossible reconnaissance mission, but had done so under circumstances that would have justified breaking several international treaties and risking a shooting war between major powers. The reckless endangerment charges began to look like the kind of risk assessment that separates exceptional military leaders from those who simply follow orders. As winter settled over the naval base where the investigation continued, a different kind of story began to emerge about Admiral Thornfield's motivations for pursuing such an aggressive public confrontation with a decorated pilot. Sources close to the investigation, speaking on condition of anonymity, suggested that the Admiral had been increasingly frustrated by what he viewed as the feminization of military culture, and that Lieutenant Commander Kowalski had become, in his mind, a symbol of changes he neither understood nor accepted. The irony was not lost on those who knew both officers' records. While Grimm had spent the last 12 years in combat zones, flying missions that most pilots would never be asked to attempt, Thornfield had spent the same period in increasingly senior staff positions, managing budgets and attending meetings in Pentagon conference rooms. The contrast between theoretical leadership and practical command experience had never been more starkly illustrated than in those few seconds on the tarmac when theory met reality. Colonel Chen, who had found herself in the impossible position of managing the aftermath of an incident that defied easy categorization, made a decision that would define her own career as much as it affected those directly involved. Rather than attempting to minimize or cover up what had occurred, she initiated a comprehensive review of command culture and disciplinary procedures that would eventually lead to significant changes in how the military addressed conflicts between senior officers and subordinates. The review process, which would take nearly a year to complete, involved interviews with hundreds of personnel across multiple commands and services. The picture that emerged was of an institution struggling to balance traditional concepts of military hierarchy with evolving standards of professional conduct and respect. Lieutenant Commander Kowalski's situation, while extreme in its public nature, was far from unique in its underlying dynamics. What made her case different was not the conflict itself, but her response to it. Rather than filing complaints, seeking transfers, or attempting to work around problematic leadership, she had continued to perform her duties with the same excellence that had defined her entire career. When confronted with behavior that crossed the line from professional authority to personal intimidation, She had responded with exactly the kind of measured, proportionate force that military training was designed to instill. The final report of the investigation, released nearly 8 months after the incident on the tarmac, was a masterpiece of diplomatic language and bureaucratic precision. Admiral Thornfield was reassigned to a staff position at a location where his responsibilities would be primarily administrative. Lieutenant Commander Kowalski was cleared of all charges and selected for promotion to full commander, with assignment to a position that would utilize her combat experience and leadership abilities to train the next generation of naval aviators. But the real vindication came not from official proceedings or personnel decisions, but from the response of those who had witnessed the confrontation and its aftermath. The story of that morning in the desert had become something larger than any individual career or controversy. It had become a reminder that sometimes, when institutional processes fail to protect those who serve with honor, the only response is the kind of quiet, professional courage that refuses to be intimidated or diminished. Commander Vera Grimm Kowalski never spoke publicly about the incident that made her famous throughout the military community. She continued to fly, to lead, and to serve with the same uncompromising excellence that had defined her career from its beginning. But those who served with her understood that something had changed, not in her character or capabilities, but in how others viewed the possibilities of leadership and the meaning of professional respect. The morning she received her promotion, standing once again on a tarmac surrounded by personnel in dress uniform, the ceremony proceeded with all the traditional formality of military protocol. But when the insignia was pinned to her collar, when the oath was administered, when she stepped forward to address the assembled personnel as their new commander, everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just a career milestone, but the acknowledgement of a standard of excellence that transcended rank, gender, or institutional politics. In her brief remarks that day, Commander Kowalski spoke about service, about the responsibility that comes with leadership, and about the importance of maintaining standards that honor the trust placed in military personnel by the nation they serve. She never mentioned the incident that had brought her to public attention, never referenced the investigation or its conclusions, never acknowledged that she had become a symbol of anything beyond professional competence and personal integrity. But in the audience, Admiral Thornfield's replacement, Rear Admiral Patricia Storm Mitchell, listened with the attention of someone who understood that the words being spoken represented more than ceremonial remarks. They represented a commitment to the kind of leadership that earns respect through action rather than demanding it through authority, that protects rather than exploits those in subordinate positions, and that measures success not by the compliance it generates, but by the excellence it inspires. The years that followed would prove that the incident on the tarmac had indeed marked a turning point, not just in one woman's career, but in how the military thought about leadership, accountability, and the standards by which its senior officers would be judged. Commander Kowalski's subsequent assignments would take her to positions of increasing responsibility, where her reputation for uncompromising professionalism and tactical brilliance would influence a generation of pilots and leaders. But perhaps more importantly, the story of that morning in the desert would continue to be told and retold wherever military personnel gathered, not as a tale of conflict or confrontation, but as a reminder that sometimes, when all other options have been exhausted, the only appropriate response to institutional bullying is the kind of quiet, professional resistance that speaks louder than any formal protest or legal proceeding. The legacy of Lieutenant Commander Vera Grimm Kowalski was not defined by a single moment of self-defense, but by a career spent proving that excellence knows no boundaries, that leadership is earned through service, and that sometimes the most powerful statement a person can make is simply refusing to be diminished, regardless of who might wish otherwise. In a profession that values courage above all other virtues, she had demonstrated that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear, or intimidation, or prejudice or institutional inertia prevent you from doing what is right. The desert wind that had carried the sound of her footsteps as she walked away from that confrontation continued to blow across the base, carrying with it the echoes of a moment when one person's refusal to be broken had reminded everyone present what it truly meant to serve with honor. And in ready rooms and flight decks around the world, whenever young pilots asked about what it takes to succeed in military aviation, the answer increasingly began with a story about a pilot whose call sign was Grim, and whose understanding of duty extended far beyond the cockpit of any aircraft she would ever fly.